I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The village of St. Mary's Mead was, to the casual observer, a sanctuary of stillness where the most pressing concern was usually the state of the vicar's dahlias. However, as Miss Jane Marple often remarked over a knitting needle, human nature is much the same everywhere, and beneath the veneer of polished silver and neatly trimmed hedges, the same passions, envy, greed and spite, simmered as surely as they did in the darkest corners of London. The occasion was the monthly meeting of the St. Mary's Benevolent Society, hosted this Tuesday by Mrs. Elspeth Vane, the widow of the late Colonel Vane. Elspeth was a woman of formidable posture and a voice that carried the authority of a military command. Her home, the Larches, was a chilly, impeccably kept Victorian villa that smelled perpetually of beeswax and damp wool. Miss Marple sat by the window, her fingers moving rhythmically through a pair of infant's booties in pale blue. Her pale blue eyes, Weaver, were not on her knitting. They were observing the room. "More tea, Arthur?" Elspeth asked, her hand steady as she tilted the heavy silver pot. Arthur Bantry, a nephew by marriage and a man who always looked slightly out of breath, reached for his cup. "Thank you, Aunt Elspeth. Most kind." Beside him sat Sibylla Thorne, a younger woman with sharp, fox-like features and a penchant for expense. Scarves that the village felt she couldn't quite afford. She was currently leaning toward Dr. Haydock, the village physician, whispering something that caused the doctor to frown and adjust his spectacles. "It is a pity," Elspeth remarked to the room at large, "that Mr. Henderson could not join us, though I suppose a man of his varied interests finds a tea party quite dull, the mention of Gree." Gory Henderson, the village's reclusive newcomer who had purchased the old mill, brought a sudden brittle silence to the room. Henderson was a collector, a term that in St. Mary's was synonymous with suspicious. "He's a very quiet man," Miss Marple chirped softly, her voice like a gentle bird. "Reminds me a bit of old Mr. Badger from my youth. He collected clocks. One never knew what time it was in his house, for they all struck at different intervals. He was hiding a very secret fondness for the local barmaid, you see. It's often the quiet ones who have the most complicated hearts." Elspeth Vane gave a sharp, dry laugh. "I doubt Mr. Henderson has a heart, Jane, only an eye for a bargain." Elspeth rose then, her movements stiff. "If you will excuse me, I've forgotten the lemon sponge. In the kitchen. Mary is so terribly forgetful these days." She swept out of the room. The conversation resumed, a low hum of talk about the upcoming parish fete and the rising cost of coal. 5 minutes passed, then 10. It was the sound that followed that broke the afternoon. Not a scream, but a heavy muffled thud from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable shattering of china. Dr. Haydock was the first to his feet, his medical instincts overriding social decorum. He hurried into the hall, with Arthur Bantry close behind. Miss Marple followed at a more measured pace, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag. They found Elspeth Vane on the black and white checkered tiles of the hallway. She lay near the kitchen door, the yellow lemon sponge scattered like confetti around her. The silver teapot she had been carrying, evidently to be refilled, was dented on the floor, a dark stain of tea seeping into the rug. Dr. Haydock knelt, his fingers pressing against her neck. After a moment he looked up, his face grim. "She's dead?" Sibylla gasped from the doorway, her hand clutching her throat. "I'm afraid so," Haydock said quietly, "but she didn't just collapse." He pointed to the back of Elspeth's neck, where a small dark puncture mark was visible just below the hairline. "This wasn't a heart attack. Someone has been very efficient and very cruel." Miss Marple did not look at the body. Instead, her gaze drifted to the side table in the hall. A single muddy footprint, small, perhaps a woman's or a slight man's, was drying on the polished wood of the bottom rung of the coat rack. And there, resting innocently among the umbrellas, was a single long knitting needle, identical to the ones in Miss Marple's own bag, but stained with a dark tell-tale crimson. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her eyes narrowing, "just like poor Miss Willoughby's canary. Silence is so very rarely natural, isn't it? By the following morning, the news of Elspeth Vane's demise had rippled Proof St. Mary's Mead with the speed of a summer gale. In the local post office, over the weighing of parcels and the sticking of stamps, the air was thick with a delicious, horrified excitement. Death was a frequent visitor to the village, usually arriving in the form of a peaceful passing in one's sleep or a dignified fading away, but a needle to the neck in one's own hallway was a different mar. Entirely. It was, as Mrs. Price Ridley remarked to anyone within earshot, positively continental in its savagery. Miss Marple arrived at the post office just as the clock struck 11, her tweed coat brushed and her expression one of mild, sorrowful bewilderment. She took her place in the queue behind Sibylla Thorne, who was looking remarkably haggard despite a generous application of rouge. Sibylla was nervously tapping a letter against her handbag, her eyes darting toward the door every time the bell chimed. "Such a tragedy, Sibylla dear," Miss Marple said softly, leaning forward. "To think we were all sitting there, discussing the benevolent society, while such a wicked thing was being planned. It puts me in mind of the time the church warden's wife found her prize marrow had been pierced with a hatpin. Not that a vegetable is the same as poor Elspeth, of course, but it's the premeditation of it that is so chilling. One must have a very steady hand for such a small target." Sibylla flinched, the envelope in her hand fluttering. "It's ghastly, Jane. Simply ghastly. And the police. Inspector Slack has been at the Larches since dawn. He's already questioned me twice. As if I could have possibly slipped out of the drawing room, murdered Elspeth, and returned without anyone noticing. It's preposterous. I was talking to Dr. Haydock the entire time. Indeed, the doctor is a very reliable witness," Miss Marple agreed, her voice humming with a gentle, hypnotic quality. "Though, if I recall, there was that brief moment when the maid, Mary, dropped the tray in the pantry. Erion looked toward the kitchen door for a second or two. "It's amazing what one can do in a second if one is hurried. But then, you've always been so quick on your feet, dear. I remember you winning the 100-yard dash at the school fete 3 years ago." Sibylla's fox-like face hardened. "I don't see what my athletic abilities have to do with anything. If you want a suspect, look at that nephew of hers, Arthur Bantry. He's been drowning in debt since that disastrous investment in the Argentinian railways. Everyone knows Elspeth wouldn't give him a penny while she was alive. She called him a weak-willed spendthrift right to his face at the Christmas gala. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Arthur Bantry entered the post office. He looked as though he hadn't slept, his collar slightly askew. He avoided the gaze of the women, heading straight for the counter to purchase a telegram form. The village, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, fell into a hushed, expectant silence. The gossip shifted like a weather vane. By noon, the consensus at the Blue Boar pub was that Arthur Bantry had committed the deed to satisfy his creditors. By 1 o'clock, the theory had evolved. Arthur had conspired with the maid, Mary, who had long been disgruntled by Mrs. Vane's habit of checking for dust with a white silk glove. However, a third and more sinister theory was gaining ground among the more imaginative residents. Gregory Henderson, the collector at the old mill, had been seen walking his dog near the boundaries of the Larches only an hour before the tea party. He was an outsy. A man who kept his curtains drawn and his business to himself. In the eyes of St. Mary's Mead, there was no greater evidence of guilt than a desire for privacy. Miss Marple, having finished her business at the post office, made her way toward the vicarage. She found the vicar's wife, Griselda, in the garden, looking uncharacteristically sombre. "The whole village is turning into a courtroom." "Jane," Griselda said, dropping a pair of pruning shears, "Inspector Slack is convinced it's an inside job. He's been measuring the distance from the drawing room to the hallway and shouting at the poor maid until she dissolved into hysterics. He thinks because the weapon was a knitting needle, it must be someone domestic. He actually looked at my knitting bag with suspicion this morning." Miss Marple sat on the stone bench, her hands folded over her purse. "Inspector Slack is a very energetic man, but he does tend to look for the most obvious person. He sees the needle and thinks of a lady's hand. He sees the debt and thinks of a nephew's motive, but he forgets that a knitting needle is merely a tool. It is the mind behind it that matters. It requires no great strength, only a knowledge of where the life resides. It is quite like the way old Mr. Timmins used to dispatch his poultry, swift, silent, and without a drop of blood on his waistcoat. He was a very tidy man, Mr. Timmins. Most people who commit crimes of that nature are remarkably tidy. You don't think it was Arthur, then? Griselda asked, leaning in. Arthur is a man who faints at the sight of a cut finger, Miss Marple remarked thoughtfully. And Sibylla, while sharp, is far too concerned with her own appearance to risk a struggle with a woman of Elspeth's stature. No, there is something else. Something about the way the silver teapot fell. It didn't roll, you see, it stayed exactly where it landed. And the lemon sponge, it was scattered so very widely. Griselda frowned. I don't follow, Jane. It means Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling with a sharp hidden intelligence, that Elspeth didn't drop the tray because she was startled. She dropped it because she was already dead before it hit the floor. The timing is everything, Griselda. People believe what they see, but they rarely see what is actually happening. They see a woman walk into a hallway and hear a crash. They assume the crash and the deed are the same event. But in nature, the lightning always precedes the thunder. As the afternoon shadows lengthened over the village, the sense of unease deepened. The silent widow was silent no more. She had become the loudest topic in every parlour. But while the inspector chased muddy footprints and debt collectors, Miss Marple remained seated on her bench, watching a small robin hop across grass. She was not thinking of footprints or silver teapots. She was thinking of a very specific conversation she had overheard months ago regarding a missing set of keys and a local map that had never been returned. The village was reacting to a murder, but Miss Marple was observing a pattern, and the pattern, she feared, was only just beginning to reveal its ugly shape. Inspector Slack was his name did not suggest, a man of relentless, albeit often misdirected, motion. By the second day following the tragedy at the Larches, he had established a temporary headquarters in the village constable's small office where he spent his hours barking into a telephone and pacing the floorboards until they creaked in protest. To Slack, the case was a matter of logistics, who was in which room, the exact minute the kettle whistled, and the verifiable whereabouts of every soul within a 2-mile radius. He viewed the village as a puzzle of moving parts, unaware that it was actually a tapestry of deep-seated emotions. Miss Marple, meanwhile, conducted her investigation in a far more traditional manner. She spent the morning in her garden, seemingly preoccupied with the encroaching groundsel. But her ears were tuned to the rhythmic clicking of the garden gate. In St. Mary's Mead, a tragedy did not stop the flow of life. It merely changed the flavour of the conversation. When the vicar's wife, Griselda, stopped by with a basket of windfall apples, Miss Marple was ready. The inspector has been to see Mr. Henderson at the old mill, Griselda reported, her eyes bright with the sort of WS that only a small town can produce. Apparently he was quite rude. He told Slack that his movements were his own business, and that if the police wanted to search his collection of medieval manuscripts, they had better return with a warrant. It hasn't helped his reputation, Jane. People are saying he has a secret room in that mill where he keeps all sorts of wicked things. Miss Marple snipped, a dead rose head with a satisfying click. Mr. Henderson is a man who prizes his privacy, which is a very dangerous thing to do in a village. It makes people imagine the worst. It reminds me so much of poor Mr. Ebbs of St. Mary's Bourne. He used to keep his cellar locked and never allowed the maid to go down there. Everyone was convinced he had a body hidden under the flagstones. It turned out he was merely fermenting a very illegal and quite explosive parsnip wine. He was embarrassed, you see. Pride, Griselda, is often mistaken for guilt. But what about the needle? Griselda asked, lowering her voice. The police have confirmed it was one of a set, a very fine steel needle. Elspeth had a matching set in her workbox, but the inspector found that the one used for the deed didn't match hers exactly. It was of a slightly older manufacture, high-quality steel, the kind they haven't made since before the war. Miss Marple paused, her fingers hovering over a leaf. Before the war? How very interesting. That suggests someone who takes care of their tools, or perhaps someone who inherited them. It isn't the sort of thing a modern young person like Sibylla would own. She prefers those plastic-headed pins that break if you look at them crossly. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself walking toward the village pond, a spot where one could often find the local children, and, more importantly, their nannies. She sat on a bench and watched the ducks, a presence so grandmotherly and unassuming that she became effectively invisible. When Mary, the maid from the Lark, appeared with a tear-stained handkerchief, Miss Marple did not pounce. She simply offered a peppermint. "It's the silence, Miss Marple," the girl sobbed, once the initial pleasantries were out of the way. "The house is so quiet now, and the inspector keeps asking me about the teapot. He wants to know if I saw anyone in the hallway when I went to fetch the hot water. I told him I didn't see a soul, but he looked at me as if I were lying. I was only in the pantry for a minute. A minute is a long time in a quiet house, Mary," Miss Marple said soothingly. "Tell me, when you were in the pantry, did you hear anything? Not a scream, perhaps, but a door closing? Or the sound of the side entrance?" Mary wiped her nose. "I heard a click, like a latch, but I thought it was just the wind, the drawer. Tea in that house is terrible, especially by the cloakroom. And there was a smell, sweet, like those dried flowers Mrs. Vane kept in the jars, only sharper, like medicine." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Sweet, like potpourri, but sharper, like oil of wintergreen, perhaps, or lavender water. Old Mrs. Gable used to use lavender water to hide the smell of the liniment she used for her gout. She was very vain about her health, poor soul." The girl nodded vaguely and hurried on her way, leaving Miss Marple to her reflections. The silent widow had been a woman of rigid habits. She took tea at 4, checked the locks at 9, and never, ever allowed anyone to enter her house through the side door without prior arrangement. Yet a latch had clicked. A footprint had been left on a side table, not the floor, which was an odd detail the inspector had dismissed as a clumsy mistake by a panicked killer. Miss Marple began to walk home, her mind clicking through the inhabitants of St. Mary's Mead like a well-oiled machine. She thought of Dr. Haydock's frown, Sibylla's expensive scarves, and Arthur Bantry's desperate eyes. She thought of the collector at the mill and his medieval manuscripts. Mostly, she thought about the silver teapot. It had been dented, yes, but it had fallen vertically. If Elspeth had been walking when she was struck, the teapot would have flown forward, sliding across the tiles. Instead, it had dropped like a stone. She wasn't walking, Miss Marple whispered to the evening air. She was standing still, waiting for someone she knew quite well, and one she didn't expect to be carrying a knitting needle. As she reached her own front door, Miss Marple noticed a small white envelope tucked into her letterbox. There was no stamp and no postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in a cramped, scholarly hand. "Some things are better left buried in the dust, Miss Marple. For your own sake, stick to your knitting. A lesser." Woman might have felt a chill of fear. Miss Marple, however, merely adjusted her spectacles and smiled a small, grim smile. Being threatened was, in her experience, a sure sign that one was finally getting somewhere. Inspector Slack did not believe in patterns of human behavior. He believed in physical evidence and obvious motives. By the third morning he was convinced he had found both. The Ville. Age was treated to the sight of a police car parked squarely in front of the Larches, and by noon the word had spread that Arthur Bantry had been taken in for formal questioning. It was the debt, of course. Slack had uncovered a series of increasingly frantic letters from a London firm of solicitors, addressed to Arthur, demanding repayment for a series of failed speculations. The motive was as old as time, and the opportunity, Slack argued, was undeniable. Miss Marple heard the news from her gardener, who was usually more interested in the drainage of the lower flower beds than the drama of the upper classes. She continued to prune her hedges, her movements deliberate and calm, though her mind was far from the foliage. She knew Arthur Bantry. He was a man of weak character, certainly a man who lacked the foresight to manage his finances, but he was also a man of profound physical cowardice. To strike a woman in the dark was one thing, but to use a knitting needle with the precision of a surgeon required a coldness of nerve that Arthur simply did not possess. The inspector, however, was triumphant. He had found a pair of Arthur's shoes in the mudroom of the Larches with trace of the same damp soil found in the hallway. More damningly, he had found a scrap of blue wool caught on the hinge of the side door, the very colour of the sweater Arthur had been wearing during the tea party. To Slack, it was a closed case. Arthur had slipped out during the confusion of the dropped tray, struck his aunt, and slipped back in. "It is all so very tidy," Miss Marple remarked to Dr. Ha. Idoc later that afternoon. The doctor had stopped by her cottage, looking weary. "And if there is one thing I have learned about life in the country, Doctor, it is that the truth is rarely tidy. It is usually quite messy and tucked away in a corner where no one thinks to look." Haydock leaned against the garden gate, sighing. "Slack is convinced, Jane. He's got the motive, the physical presence, and the lack of an alibi for those crucial 3 minutes. Arthur claims he went to the cloakroom because he felt a sudden bout of indigestion. The salmon paste sandwiches, he says, but no one can verify it. It's his word against the silence of the house. Indigestion is a very convenient excuse, but a very human one," Miss Marple said, her eyes following a butterfly. "But tell me, Doctor, as a man of science, does the wound really suggest a man of Arthur's height? Arthur is quite tall, nearly 6 feet. Elspeth was a small woman, and she was standing. To strike downward into the medulla oblongata with such accuracy, would a tall, panicked man not have struck at a different angle?" Haydock straightened, his brow furrowing. "I hadn't thought of it in those terms. It was a level strike. Almost horizontal. It suggests someone of similar height to Mrs. Vane, or someone who had positioned themselves very carefully." "Exactly," Miss Marple murmured. "And then there is the matter of the scrap of blue wool. If Arthur had been so careful as to use a needle for silence, would he have been so careless as to snag his sweater on a door he knows perfectly well how to open? It's like the case of T. E. village baker's son, who was accused of stealing apples because his cap was found in the orchard. It turned out the real thief had stolen the cap first to leave a trail. A very old trick, but surprisingly effective. As the doctor departed, Miss Marple decided it was time for a more direct approach. She donned her sturdy walking shoes and her best felt hat and made her way toward the old mill. The village was determined to look at the obvious suspect. She would look at the one everyone was trying to avoid. Gregory Henderson was sitting on his porch, a heavy leather-bound volume on his lap. He did not look up as she approached, his face a mask of scholarly indifference. "It's a beautiful afternoon for reading, Mr. Henderson," Miss Marple began, her voice cheerful, "though I imagine the light in the mill can be a bit tricky for such old parchment." Henderson looked up then, his eyes sharp and guarded. "The light is sufficient, Miss Marple. What is not sufficient is the privacy I was promised when I moved to this parish. I've already told the inspector I know nothing of Mrs. Vane's death. I was here with my books, as I am every afternoon." Of course, she said, "Tired. Books are such wonderful companions. They don't gossip and they don't keep secrets, except, of course, the ones written inside them. I was just thinking of a collection I once saw in a house in Devon. It belonged to a lady who had a very rare set of botanical prints. She was quite protective of them. She used a very specific type of old steel needle to pin the delicate pages when she was repairing them. Most unusual." Henderson's hand tightened on the edge of his book. For a fleeting second the mask slipped, revealing not guilt, but a flash of genuine cold alarm. "I wouldn't know about that. I deal in texts, not needles." "Naturally," Miss Marple replied, her tone as sweet as honey. "But do tell me, Mr. Henderson, did you happen to notice the scent of lavender water when you were near the Larches the other day? It's such an old-fashioned smell. My friend Mrs. Gable used it, but I've noticed it's become quite popular again among those who have something to hide. It covers the smell of chemicals so effectively." Henderson stood up, his book sliding to the floor with a dull thud. "I think you should go, Miss Marple. You are a very observant woman, but observation can lead to complications. Arthur Bantry is in custody. The law is satisfied. Why aren't you?" "Because," Miss Marple said, turning to leave with a slight, polite nod. "I have never found that the law and the truth are necessarily on speaking terms. Good day to you, Mr. Henderson." As she walked away, Miss Marple felt the weight of his gaze on her back. She had confirmed two things. Henderson was terrified of something other than the police, and he was far more involved in the social fabric of the village than he let on. The inspector might have his suspects, but Miss Marple now had her first real clue. It wasn't the wool, and it wasn't the debt. It was the smell of lavender water and the horizontal angle of a killing blow. The following morning, the atmosphere in St. Mary's Mead had shifted from ked silence to a sort of grim satisfaction. With Arthur Bantry securely in the hands of the law, the village felt it could breathe again. The predator had been identified, or so they believed, but Miss Marple, who was currently on her hands and knees in her own garden, was not concerned with the satisfaction of the masses. She was thinking about a very small, very specific detail that had been varying her since the moment she saw the silver teapot lying on the checkered floor. She had returned to the Larches under the guise of delivering a sympathy note to Mary, the maid. The house was now under the guardianship of a solitary constable who sat in the kitchen drinking tea, allowing Miss Marple to wander toward the side garden where the clue of the blue wool had been found. To Inspector Slack, the scrap of wool was a triumphant end to a trail. To Jane Marple, it was an invitation to look closer. She adjusted her spectacles and peered at the hinges of the side door. The door was an old, heavy oak affair, slightly warped by the damp English winters. It required a firm hand to shut properly. Miss Marple pulled a small magnifying glass from her pocket, an item she carried as frequental. As others carried a prayer book. She wasn't looking for wool this time. She was looking at the dust, specifically the lack of it on the upper latch. If someone had entered or exited in a hurry, they would have grabbed the handle. But the latch itself, high up and rarely used, showed a clean, bright streak, as if it had been manipulated by someone wearing a glove. And yet, she whispered to hers, "Elf, the scrap of wool was caught on the lower hinge. A very low position for a man of Arthur's height to snag himself, unless he were crawling." She moved further down the path, past the rhododendrons that lined the boundary between the Larches and the public footpath. The ground here was soft, but the inspector's heavy-booted men had already trampled much of the evidence. Miss Marple, however, drifted toward the compost heap at the very edge of the property. It was a place no one of importance would visit, making it the perfect repository for things one wished to vanish. With the tip of her umbrella, she began to poke gently through the top layer of grass clippings and wilted vegetable peelings. Most of it was exactly what one would expect, the refuse of a well-ordered kitchen. But then, her umbrella struck something that didn't yield. It was a small, rectangular object, partially obscured by a discarded cabbage leaf. She reached down, using her handkerchief to lift it. It was a small, ornate tin of lozenges, the kind sold in high-end London chemists. The label was faded, but the brand was unmistakable, Bates & Sons menthol and eucalyptus. It was an expensive, somewhat old-fashioned remedy for a sore throat. Miss Marple opened the tin. Inside were not lozenges, but a small, crumpled piece of blotting paper and a single glass vial, now empty, which retained the faint, cloying scent of the lavender water she had mentioned to Mr. Henderson. She sniffed the vial cautiously. There was the lavender, yes, but beneath it was something sharper, more metallic. The scent Mary had described as medicine. It was the smell of a local anesthetic, something a dentist or a surgeon might use to numb a surface before a procedure. "How very clever," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes widening behind her glasses. Not for the victim, but for the weapon. She realized then that the knitting needle hadn't just been a convenient tool, it had been prepared. If one were to coat a needle in a concentrated solution, even a small puncture would be enough to ensure the victim could not cry out, could not struggle, and would collapse almost instantly. The thud we heard wasn't the sound of a struggle. It was the sound of a woman whose nervous system had been momentarily short-circuited before the final, fatal thrust. But it was the blotting paper that caught her interest most. She smoothed it out with trembling fingers. It wasn't blank. It bore the ghost of an impression, the reversed marks of a signature and a date from a week prior. It was not Elspeth Vane's signature. The handwriting was cramped, scholarly, and identical to the note she had received in her letterbox the night before. The pieces of the village puzzle were beginning to shift. Mr. Henderson at the mill was a collect, or of books, but blotting paper suggested he was also a man of correspondence, and if he was corresponding with Elspeth Vane, why had no letters been found in her desk? The inspector had searched the house and found only the bills and Arthur's desperate pleas for money. Miss Marple stood up, her knees aching slightly from the damp ground. She thought of a story from years ago, the case of the local draper who had been blackmailed by his own brother. The brother hadn't used threats. He had used the draper's own sense of propriety against him. Elspeth Vane had been a woman of immense propriety. She would have hated a scandal more than she loved her own life. It wasn't greed, Miss Marple realized, looking back at the silent, imposing silhouette of the larches. Arthur was the obvious motive, but Arthur is a creature of the present. This crime belongs to the past. It belongs to someone who knows the value of an old steel needle and the silence of a secret buried for 40 years. She tucked the tin into her bag, her mind already racing toward the next step. She needed to know what was in those medieval manuscripts Mr. Henderson prized so highly. More importantly, she needed to know why. Sibylla Thorne had been seen crying near the mill 2 days before the murder. The hidden clue wasn't just the tin or the vial, it was the realization that the murder hadn't been an interruption of the tea party. The tea party had been the stage, and everyone in that room, including herself, had been an unwitting audience to a performance that had begun long before the first scone was buttered. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary's Mead, casting long skeletal shadows across the lanes as Miss Marple made her way toward the cottage of Sibylla Thorne. The village was in that peculiar state of suspended animation that follows an arrest. The immediate danger was perceived to be over, yet a lingering sourness remained in the air. Miss Marple knew that now was the time to strike. When people feel safe, they become careless. When they believe the blame has been settled elsewhere, they allow the masks they wear for their neighbours to slip just a fraction. She found Sibylla in her small, overgrown garden. Though she wasn't gardening, she was pacing the narrow stone path, a cigarette held between trembling fingers. The expensive silk scarf she wore, a vibrant splash of emerald, seemed at OD. DS with her sallow complexion and the dark circles beneath her eyes. She looked like a woman who had been hollowed out by a very specific kind of fear. "Sibylla, dear," Miss Marple called out, her voice a gentle chime of normalcy. "I was just passing and wondered if you might have a spare cutting of that lovely winter jasmine? Mine has been so temperamental lately." Sibylla startled, nearly droppy. Her cigarette. "Jane, you gave me quite a shock. I'm not sure the jasmine is in any state for cuttings. Everything seems to be dying back this year." Miss Marple stepped through the gate, her eyes missing nothing, the way Sibylla's gaze flicked toward the road, the way her hand moved instinctively to cover the clasp of her handbag. Plants are so like people, aren't they? They require the rig, HT environment to flourish. If there is a secret rot at the root, no amount of pruning will save the flower. It's a bit like the situation with poor Elspeth, I suppose. Such a firm, upright woman, yet someone felt the need to cut her down. Sibylla's laugh was brittle and high-pitched. "Well, the police have Arthur. I suppose the rot was in the family all along. A tragic business, but at least it settled." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked, her tone conversational. "I was speaking to Dr. Haydock earlier. He mentioned that the angle of the strike was most peculiar. And then there is the matter of the lavender water. You've always been so fond of it, haven't you, Sibylla? I remember you used to buy it by the gallon from the chemist in much deeping—" The younger woman froze. The cigarette smoke led between them in the still air. "I don't know what you're implying, Jane. Everyone in this village uses lavender. It's hardly a crime." "Not a crime at all," Miss Marple agreed, "unless it is used to mask the smell of something else, something like a dental anesthetic. It's a trick I heard of once in a very old court case. A woman wanted to silence a witness without a struggle. She was a very clever woman, but she made the mistake of thinking that because people are polite, they are also blind. Sibylla turned away, her shoulders hunching. You should be careful, Jane. You're an old woman. You shouldn't be poking your nose into things that don't concern you. Elspeth was a difficult woman. She held things over people. She thought she was the moral compass of this village, but he was just a cruel, judgmental old harpy who liked to watch people squirm. And did she make you squirm, Sibylla? Miss Marple's voice was no longer bird-like. It had the cold, hard edge of a diamond. Was it the money, or was it the fact that she knew where you were really going on those shopping trips to London? I've often thought that a collector like Mr. Henderson might find a young woman with expensive tastes very useful for obtaining things, rare things, things that might be found in the libraries of houses where a young woman is invited for tea. Sibylla's face went white. I didn't kill her. I couldn't have. I was in the drawing room. Yes, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, the drawing room, but the drawing room has a French window, and the French window leads to the shrubbery, which leads directly to the side door, and Mary was in the pantry. If someone knew the house, knew the timing of the tea, and knew exactly where Elspeth would be standing when she returned from the kitchen. Stop it, Sibylla cried. She was shaking now, her composure utterly shattered. You don't understand what she was like. She was going to tell the inspector, not about the murder, about the bee. Ooks. She found one in my bag. She called me a common thief. She said she was going to have me cast out of the village. I went to see her the day before. I begged her, but she just sat there drinking her tea, looking at me as if I were a beetle she was about to step on. So you went to Mr. Henderson, Miss Marple prompted gently. He told me he would handle it, Sibylla whispered, her voice bare, audible. He said he had a way to make her see reason. I didn't know about the needle, Jane, I swear it. When I heard the thud in the hall, I nearly fainted. I realized then that he hadn't come to talk. He had come to finish it. Miss Marple watched the girl, a profound sadness in her eyes. It was as she suspected, a web of small greeds and large fears. Sibylla was a thief, yes, and a coward, but she was not a killer. She was the tool, much like the knitting needle, sharpened and used by a much more dangerous mind. You must tell the inspector, Sibylla, Miss Marple said, before Mr. Henderson decides that you are the next problem that needs to be handled. A man who collects secrets is never satisfied with just one. Sibylla didn't answer. She slumped onto a garden bench, buried her face in her hands, and began to sob. Miss Marple stood for a moment, then turned and walked quietly back to the gate. She had the confrontation she needed, and the secrets were finally spilling out into the light. But as she walked toward the old mill, she knew the most dangerous part of the game was yet to come. Gregory Henderson would not be as easy to break as Sibylla thought. Nay, and he was currently holding a book that contained more than just medieval text. It contained the one thing Elspeth Fane had died to protect. The shadows had stretched into long, skeletal fingers by the time Miss Marple reached the old mill. The structure sat like a brooding sentinel at the edge of the village, the water of the mill race churning with a low, rhythmic growl that seemed to vibrate in the very soles of her shoes. It was a place of damp stone and ancient wood, a stark contrast to the manicured gardens of St. Mary's Mead. As she approached, she noticed a flickering light in the upper window. Mr. Henderson was still at his studies. However, as she drew closer to the side entrance, her foot struck something metallic. It was a bicycle, discarded hastily in the tall grass, its statuette, eels still spinning slowly. It belonged to Arthur Bantry's younger brother Peter, who was supposed to be away at university. This unexpected presence was the first crack in the narrative Miss Marple had constructed. She paused, blending into the darkness of a willow tree, as the heavy mill door creaked open. Instead of a confrontation between a scholar and a thief, a different scene unfolded. Pet. Ere Bantry stumbled out, his face pale and his breathing ragged. He didn't see Miss Marple. He simply scrambled onto his bicycle and pedalled furiously toward the village. The air he left behind carried a sharp, unmistakable scent, not of lavender, but of old charred paper. Miss Marple did not follow the boy. Instead, she stepped inside the mill, the door having been left unlatched in Peter's haste. The interior was a labyrinth of crates and overflowing bookshelves, illuminated by the harsh glow of a single electric lamp on Henderson's desk. Gregory Henderson was not there. The room was empty, but a small iron brazier in the corner was smoking. Moving with a surprising nimbleness, Miss Marple reached the brazier and used a nearby letter opener to rescue a few fragments of parchment that had N.O.T. yet been consumed by the flames. These were not medieval manuscripts. Even in their charred state, the copperplate handwriting was clearly Victorian, elegant, looped, and unmistakably that of a young Elspeth Vane. As she squinted at the fragments, her heart gave a small, uncharacteristic flutter. The child must be settled. The scandal would destroy the Colonel's commission. Better that the Lage believes the widow of St. Jude's took him in. The twist was as sharp as the needle that had killed Elspeth. The silent widow was not just a title given to the woman who lived at the Larches. It was a legacy of a secret birth, a child given away to protect a military career. But the revelation deepened as Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the floor behind the desk. There, lying in a heap, was the heavy leather-bound volume Henderson had been Ding! Earlier. It had been sliced open, the hollowed-out center revealing not a hidden letter, but a small, velvet-lined compartment. It was empty. A sudden movement in the rafters above caused her to look up. Gregory Henderson was standing on the gallery, his face obscured by the gloom. He wasn't holding a book. He was holding a heavy iron key. "You are quite the trespasser, Miss Marple," he said, his voice echoing in the hollow space of the mill. "I warned you to stick to your knitting. Now you've seen the ashes of a reputation. Peter Bantry came here to reclaim what he thought was his inheritance. He thinks he's the rightful heir to the Vanney estate, the grandson of the child Elspeth gave away." Miss Marple smoothed her apron, her composure returning like a shield. "And is he Mr. Henderson? Or did you merely lead him to believe that so he would provide a convenient distraction for the inspector?" A desperate young man is such a useful thing when one needs to dispose of a troublesome widow. "The boy is a fool," Henderson spat, descending the wooden stairs. He thought those letters would make him rich. He didn't realize that in this village, a secret is only valuable as long as it's a secret. Once it's told, it's just gossip. And Elspeth was going to burn them herself. She called me here to witness the end of it. She wanted to clear her conscience before she died, but she didn't die of a guilty conscience, Miss Marple countered softly. She died of a steel needle, and you weren't burning letters out of the goodness of your heart, were you? You were burning them because they proved that the widow of St. Jude's, the woman who took the child, was your own mother. You didn't want the village to know that your scholarly family began its fortune with a piece of high society blackmail. Henderson stopped on the bottom step. The iron key clutched so tightly his knuckles were white. The low growl of the mill race seemed to grow louder. A relentless sound had filled the silence between them. The twist was not that Peter was the killer, or even that Henderson was the blackmailer. The twist was that there were two sets of secrets, entwined like ivy, and the murder had been committed not to reveal the truth, but to ensure that the silence of the past remained unbroken. "You have no proof," Henderson whispered. "The letters are ash. The needle is with T. He police, and they believe it belongs to Arthur. Sibylla is too terrified to speak. What do you have, Jane Marple? Only your stories about village life and your observations of human nature." "I have the silver teapot," she said, her voice steady and clear. "And I have the knowledge that a man who collects books should know better than to use a local anesthetic that leaves a chemical residue on tea. The very pages he tries to hide. You didn't just kill Elspeth, Mr. Henderson. You tried to kill the truth, but the truth is like a perennial. It always finds a way to break through the soil." Outside, the first droplets of rain began to drum against the mill stone walls, a cold, rhythmic tapping that sounded like 1,000 needles striking the earth. Miss Marple stood her ground, an old woman in tweed coat, facing a man who had spent his life in the shadows. The game was no longer subtle. It was a race to the final revelation, and the air in the mill was thick with the scent of lavender, ashes, and impending justice. The rain, which had begun as a light tapping against the mill's ancient stones, had intensified into a rhythmic drumming that isolated Miss Marple and Gregory Henderson in a world of damp shadows and cold air. Henderson remained on the bottom step of the staircase, his shadow cast long and distorted across the floor by the single flickering lamp. He looked less like a scholar now, and more like a cornered animal, his eyes darting toward the iron brazier where the last of the embers were dying. He believed he had won. He believed that by turning the evidence to ash, he had erased the bridge between his motive and Elspeth Fane's death. Miss Marple, however, took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind she used when preparing to navigate a particularly difficult turn in a knitting pattern. She reached into her large, sensible handbag and pulled out a small, lace-trimmed handkerchief. She didn't use it to dab her brow. Instead, she held it out toward the light. "Do. You know, Mr. Henderson, what I find most fascinating about village life? It is the way people assume that because something is old, it is also forgotten. You think the letters were the only record Elspeth's secret. You think that by burning them, you have secured your family's reputation and your own future." She stepped closer to the desk, her expression one of mild, grandmotherly concern. You see, Elspeth Fane was a woman of meticulous habit. She didn't just keep letters, she kept a diary. A very small, very inconspicuous diary that she hid not in a hollowed-out book, for she knew your tastes, you see, but in a place so mundane that a man of your intellectual stature would never dream of looking. She hid it in the recipe box in the kitchen, filed under L for lemon sponge, hen. Derson's face twitched. The mention of the sponge cake, the very thing that had been scattered across the floor at the moment of the murder, sent a visible tremor through his frame. "You're lying," he hissed. "I searched that house. I know every corner of it." "You searched for secrets, Mr. Henderson, but you didn't look for the truth," Miss Marple replied, her voice gaining a certain resonance. "You were so busy playing the part of the sophisticated blackmailer that you forgot that Elspeth was a mother who had spent 40 years regretting a choice made for her by a rigid military husband. She didn't want to burn those letters because she was ashamed. She wanted to burn them because she had finally decided to leave everything to the boy, to Peter. She was going to acknowledge him as her grandson and give him the Varney inheritance. That is why you had to kill her, not to protect her reputation, but to prevent the fortune from leaving your reach. If Peter became the heir, your hold over the estate and your mother's legacy of management would vanish. Henderson took a step toward her, his hands curling into fists. "Even if such a diary exists, it doesn't prove I killed her. It only proves I had a reason to dislike her. You have no witness. You have no weapon." "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling with a sharp, dangerous light. "I told you earlier about the lavender water. You mocked me for it. But you see, I noticed something when I was in your laboratory. Oh yes, I call it a laboratory, for no collector of books needs so many chemical solvents. You have a bottle of a very specific high-grade surgical spirit. It is used to clean old parchment, but it is also the perfect base for the anesthetic you used on the needle. And the needle itself? I didn't tell the inspector the truth about the one I found in the garden." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The police have the needle that killed Elspeth, yes. But I found its twin. You see, these needles were a pair, a match set given to your mother by Elspeth's own hand years ago, when they were still friends in that complicated transactional way blackmailers and victims often are. I have it here in my bag, and do you know what is on the tip of this needle, Mr. Henderson? Not blood, but a very specific blue dye that is used only in restoration of medieval manuscripts. The same blue dye that is currently staining the underside of your right thumbnail." Henderson instinctively jerked his hand behind his back, his eyes widening in a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. It was the critical reaction Miss Marple had been waiting for, the psychological slip that confirmed the physical truth. There was no blue dye on his thumb, but the fact that he believed there could be was the final confession she required. The man of intellect had been undone by a simple grandmotherly bluff. "You're a clever woman, Jane Marple," Henderson said, his voice cracking. He lunged toward her, but his foot caught on the very crate he had been using to hide his stolen treasures. He stumbled, and in that moment, The heavy mill door swung open wit. A crash. It was not the inspector, but Dr. Haydock, standing there with a heavy walking stick and a face full of grim determination. Behind him, the silhouette of a police constable moved into the light. Miss Marple had not come to the mill alone. She had merely ensured she arrived first to set the stage. "I believe," Miss Marple said, tidying her hair with a graceful shaking hand, "that Mr. Henderson is ready to discuss the matter of the silver teapot in more detail. It is a very heavy object, Doctor. Quite enough to cause a thud when dropped, but not nearly as heavy as the weight of a secret kept for 40 years. As the constable moved forward to take Henderson into custody, Miss Marple turned back to the dying fire in the brazier. She reached in with her umbrella and pulled out a sigh. Snglay, uncharred corner of a photograph that had survived the flames. It showed a young woman, smiling tentatively, holding a small child in a lace gown. The silent widow had been found, and though the truth was a bitter thing, it was, at last, no longer a secret. The following afternoon, the drawing-room of the Larches felt colder than usual, despite the roaring fire that Mary had managed to kin. It lay in the hearth. Inspector Slack sat stiffly in a velvet armchair, his notebook open, looking like a man who was prepared to be annoyed, but was forced to be curious. Dr. Haydock stood by the mantelpiece, while Arthur Bantry, recently released and looking terribly shaken, sat hunched in the corner. Sibylla Thorne was also present, her emerald scarf replaced by a sombre grey wool, her eyes fixed her own lap. Miss Marple sat in the centre of them all, her knitting needles clicking with a steady, comforting rhythm that belied the gravity of her words. "It is a very sad business," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle yet firm, "but to understand why Elspeth Vane died, one must stop looking at the money Arthur owed or the books Sibylla took. Those were merely the symptoms of a much older ill. You see, Inspector, the motive for this murder was not something that happened last week. It was something that happened 40 years ago in a small village called St. Jude's. It was the secret of a child born out of wedlock, a child Elspeth was forced to give away to protect the Colonel's career. That child was raised by a woman the village knew as the widow of St. Jude's. That woman was Greg. Ori Henderson's mother." A collective gasp echoed through the room, but Miss Marple did not pause. The Hendersons were never scholars by trade. They were professional keepers of secrets. Gregory inherited his mother's records. He knew that Elspeth had been paying a quiet, steady sum for years, but as Elspeth grew older and the Colonel passed away, her conscience began to weigh more heavily than her pride. She wanted to make amends. She had discovered that her grandson, Peter Bantry, a child of the son she had given away, was living in reduced circumstances. She decided to bypass Arthur and leave the bulk of the Varney estate to Peter. That was the reason Gregory Henderson went to make her see. If the secret was made public by Elspeth herself, the blackmail would end, the golden goose would be dead. Inspector Slack cleared his throat, leaning forward. "That explains the motive, Miss Marple, but not the method. The door was locked, and we found Bantry's wool on the hinge." Miss Marple smiled sadly. That was the cleverest part of Mr. Henderson's plan, and also his undoing. He didn't slip in through the side door during the tea party. He was already in the house. He had come earlier, using the side key he had borrowed from Sibylla's bag weeks ago, a detail she was too frightened to admit. He hid in the cloakroom, knowing the exact routine of the Benevolent Society meetings. He knew Elspeth would go to the kitchen to fetch the lemon sponge and the refilled teapot. He waited for that precise moment of transition when the hallway would be empty and the drawing-room full of chat. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes turning toward the window. The murder itself was a marvel of cold-blooded efficiency. He didn't need strength. He used a local anesthetic, likely procaine, which he'd sourced for his manuscript restoration. He coated the needle, and when Elspeth stepped into the hall, he struck. The anesthetic ensured she didn't scream. She didn't even drop the tray media. Telly, she simply froze as her nervous system failed, then collapsed. The thud we heard was timed perfectly with his exit. He snagged a piece of Arthur's old blue sweater, which he'd taken from the mudroom earlier, on the door hinge to point the finger at the most obvious suspect. He then simply walked out the side door and circled back to the mill. But the silver teapot, Doctor. Haydock interrupted. You kept mentioning it, Jane. What was its significance? The teapot told me she was standing still, Miss Marple explained. If she had been attacked by a panicked Arthur or a fleeing Sibylla, the tray would have been flung, but it dropped vertically. It meant she was facing her killer, and she wasn't afraid. She was likely speaking to him, perhaps telling him one last time that she was done with his threats. And then there was the matter of the height. A man of Arthur's stature would have struck downward, but the wound was horizontal. Gregory Henderson is a slight man, exactly the same height as Elspeth Vane. They stood eye to eye when the needle was driven home. Inspector Slack looked at his notes, then at the frail woman in front of him. And the diary? The one why? Oh, mentioned at the mill? We haven't found a diary in a recipe box. Miss Marple's knitting needles stopped for a moment. That, Inspector, was a little piece of village imagination. There was no diary in the lemon sponge file, but a man with a guilty conscience doesn't know the difference between a bluff and a fact. He believed it existed because he knew that such a record should exist. He betcha. Eyed himself by his own fear. He believed I had found the blue dye on his thumb because he knew he had been careless with his chemicals. It is a curious thing, but the more intellectual a man thinks he is, the easier he is to deceive with a simple human truth. The room remained silent for a long time. The mystery was no longer a puzzle of footprints and debts. It was a tragedy of a mother's regret. Tea and a blackmailer's greed. Arthur Bantry looked at Miss Marple with a mixture of awe and shame, while Sibylla Thorne quietly wept into her handkerchief. The silent widow had finally been heard, but the price of the truth had been a life. I suppose, Miss Marple said, picking up a dropped stitch with expert precision, that we all have things we'd rather keep under the floorboards, but as I've always said, secrets are like damp, they always rise eventually. It's much better to open the windows and let the air in, no matter how cold it might be. A week had passed since the arrest of Gregory Henderson, and a deceptive peace had returned to St. Mary's Mead. The heavy rains had ceased, leaving the village washed clean and sparkling under a pale wintry sun. To a stranger passing through, the sight of the vicar's wife tending to the parish notice board, or the smoke curling lazily from the chimneys of the high street, would suggest a place where nothing of consequence ever happened. But for those who lived there, the air still held a faint metallic chill, a reminder that the silent widow had left a void that the usual village gossip could not quite fill. Miss Marple sat in her favori, tay armchair by the window, the blue infant's booties finally completed and tucked away in a box of tissue paper. She was watching a robin redbreast hop along the garden wall, its sharp, inquisitive eyes reminding her uncomfortably of the late Elspeth Vane. The larches was now empty, its curtains drawn and its polished silver likely packed away into crates. Arthur Bantry had left for London to set his affairs, bolstered by a small, unexpected inheritance that Elspeth had, in a final act of complicated mercy, left for his immediate debts. The bulk of the estate, however, was now tied up in a legal trust for young Peter Bantry, whose life was about to change in ways he could scarcely imagine. Griselda, the vicar's wife, dropped by in the late afternoon, carrying a tin of shortbread and a ace full of contemplative wonder. She sat down opposite Miss Marple, ignoring her own tea as it grew cold. "It's the quiet that bothers me most, Jane," Griselda admitted, her usual spark of mischief dampened. "Now that the police have gone, and the newspapers have found a new scandal in the city, everyone is acting as if Gregory Henderson was never here. They talk about the weather and the price of eggs, but they avoid the old mill as if it were haunted. Is it always like this? Does the village just swallow the truth?" Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her fingers resting lightly on a new ball of wool. "The village has a very strong digestion, dear. It has to. If we lived every day with the memory of what our neighbours were truly capable of, we should never be able to ask for a pound of sugar with a straight face. We prefer the surface of things. It's a form of protection. But the truth isn't gone. It's simply become part of the soil. It will colour the flowers next spring, in a manner of speaking. People will be a little more careful with their keys and perhaps a little kinder to recluses, or perhaps more suspicious. That is the way of the world. But what about Sibylla, Grizzle? Dar asked. She's selling her cottage, you know. She says the damp is getting to her lungs, but we all know it's the way people look at her scarves now. They don't see silk, they see the things she took to pay for them. Sibylla will find another village, Miss Marple said with a sigh, and she will likely find another Mr. Henderson, or perhaps someone worse. She hasn't learned that the things we want are rarely worth the things we have to give up to get them. She reminds me of a parlour maid my aunt once had, a girl named Annie. Annie stole a lace handkerchief once, not because she needed it, but because she wanted to feel like the sort of person who owned lace. It's a very sad type of vanity. It leaves one with a very cold heart. The two women sat in silence for a while, the only sound ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Miss Marple thought of the silver teapot, now likely sitting in a police evidence locker, and the way it had reflected the flickering firelight on that terrible afternoon. She thought of Elspeth Vane's face, not the stern, judgmental mask she showed the benevolent society, but the face of the young woman in the charred photograph, holding a child she would have to lose. I often wonder, Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself, if Elspeth knew Gregory was the blackmailer's son from the start. I suspect she did. I suspect she kept him close because he was her only link to the past she had buried. We often cling to our captors when they are the only ones who know who we really are. It is a very human failing to prefer a cruel truth to a kind lie. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Miss Marple stood up to draw the curtains. The day was over, and the mystery of St. Mary's Mead was, for all intents and purposes, resolved. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but Miss Marple knew that the real ledger, the one kept by the heart, was far more difficult to balance. "You look tired, Jane," Griselda said softly, rising to leave. "Not tired, dear," Miss Marple replied, giving her a small, reassuring smile. "Just thoughtful. Every time I think I have seen the full extent of what people will do to one another, someone finds a new way to surprise me. It's a bit like a knitting pattern you've worked 100 times. Just when you think you know the stitch, your hand slips and you find a knot you didn't expect. But one must just keep going, mustn't one? There is always the next row to consider." She walked Griselda to the door, smelling the scent of wood smoke and damp earth on the evening breeze. After the door was closed and the bolts were shot, Miss Marple returned to her chair. She picked up her needles, the rhythmic clicking starting once more. The village was silent, the secrets were aired, and the widow was finally at rest. For now, in this small corner of the world, there was nothing left to do but wait for the next turn of the season and the next time human nature decided to reveal its complicated, deadly face.